In the liturgy of Yom Kippur, there's a section of the service, we call it the Martyrology. And the Martyrology recounts the death of 10 great rabbis, the Asara Harugei Malchut, who were executed during the period of the disastrous revolt of Bar Kokhba that took place in the years 132 to 135, the Common Era. And one of those whose story is recounted is Rabbi Akiva. According to the account we have in our Machzor, he was tortured by having his skin flayed with combs of iron. By the way, all of this material is related at greater length, and if it's possible, even more graphically, in the opening chapter of the Talmudic tractate Avodah Zarah. And it was a horrific episode in the course of Jewish history, a period of profound sorrow. And whatever the literal or historical truth behind the Talmudic story, and we're never quite sure how factual these are, as opposed to, say, pedagogical, the intent was clear that there would be no transmission of rabbinic Judaism. There would be no religious leaders to keep alive, to keep intact the tradition, the chain of tradition, which the Jewish tradition depended upon for its own continuity. They were going to eliminate the link in the chain and end it. But the Talmudic tractate Kiddushin, another place, has a very different take on that day. And they say that any day that tragedy visits the world, God sends it a compensatory gift. And so Kiddushin says there, while Rabbi Akiva was dying of his wounds, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, was born. I have no idea of the literal truth of this, but it's telling, because Rabbi Judah the Prince, of course, edited the Mishnah, the great code of Jewish law, completed sometime around the year 200 of the Common Era. And it is remarkable that a mere 60 plus years after the decimation of the ranks of scholars, another scholar, perhaps greater than Rabbi Akiva himself, stood up and gave us one of the great literary accomplishments of Jewish history. The editing of the Mishnah is one of a handful of literary achievements that are seldom, if ever, replicated. Imagine that. On the day that they were sure, the Romans were sure that they'd ended Jewish tradition, in fact, they didn't know that pretty soon it would reach another stage of greatness. And I want to share a little story from my personal experience to show you that sometimes on that day of tragedy, God does send us a gift, and we have to be perceptive enough to receive that gift, but the gift is there nonetheless. So I tell you my own story. When I was a kid, I loved sports. I mean, I was watching sports as soon as my hand was high enough to reach the dial on the black and white television in our house. And what could have been better? What could have been grander for an 8-year-old, for a third grade student, what I was, than to watch the Munich Olympics in 1972? What could have been better than that? I mean, we knew we have a chance to see this great Jewish swimmer. His name was Mark Spitz. Anyone who was alive in that time, and probably a lot who weren't, know the following. Mark Spitz did not disappoint. 7 races, 7 gold medals, 7 world records. Hard to beat that. And we were there to cheer on USA basketball. USA basketball, the best team in the world, and I won't go too far into what happened there. But that squad included 2 of our hometown Terrapins from those great teams of the early 70s, Len Elmore and Tommy McMillan. They were 2 of the players on that team. And there were lots of other great athletes you could have watched in those 72 games. People really at the top of their craft. And I was sure this an event, I'm going to remember this event, even though I'm a kid, for a very long time. But of course, I did not know the precise reason I would remember it and be talking about it all these years later. It was, of course, during those Olympics that a Palestinian terror group, it called itself the Black September. One might say it was the Hamas of its day. It broke into the Olympic village where the athletes were stationed. And they burst into the room which was housing the Israeli athletes. And by the way, I just want to clarify for you that when I say Israeli athletes, I'm using the term a little bit loosely, because among those who would be martyred that day was a weightlifter whose name was David Berger. David Berger was born and raised in Shaker Heights, Ohio, right outside Cleveland, the home of Case Western Reserve University. He earned a bachelor's degree at Tulane University in New Orleans. There's a plaque at Tulane in his memory to the present day. You can see it. And after completing Tulane in 1966, he went to Columbia and he did the joint law business program, the JD MBA program, which he also completed successfully. In fact, his father once was asked, "Is your son David Berger the greatest weightlifter in the world?" He said, "I have no idea, but I know he's the smartest weightlifter in the world, that's for sure." But being a Zionist, shortly after completing that program at Columbia University, he made Aliyah, and under the law of return, he could become a citizen and compete for the state of Israel, which is what he did. But it was on that day, when 11 of our brothers and sisters lost their lives, that a certain innocence was kind of lost, for me anyway. You know, I always thought as a child, I think most children believe this, that whatever difficulties existed in your parents' time, they're on the way out. They're less. What they went through is harder to make it a little bit easier for you. And my elders, I guess through the eyes of an 8-year-old, I'm an elder too, but the elders would say this. They'd say, as the schwer zu sein a Yid, it's difficult to be a Jew, they would say. And that wasn't just a comic trope. It wasn't a reflection on overeating or overthinking. It was a reflection of reality, a reality that Jewish lives were always in danger. And the idea that we were any safer was false. And in case anyone on that day in 1972 missed the memo, the events of the years immediately following reinforced it. You know what happened the following year. In 1973, there was a war on Yom Kippur, a war which came as close to Israel's destruction as has ever been the case in its history. If there was any war that was an absolute disaster, that was it. That was it. And by the way, the slogan in those years was, the Arabs were going to drive us into the sea, kind of like from the river to the sea. And that's a haunting period of time on this day 51 years ago. And in 1974, this in the United States, you'd remember, because the United States had the gall, the chutzpah, the audacity to aid Israel so it didn't get wiped off the map, what was the response of the Arab world? An oil embargo. Remember that? It was there was gas rationing, went on even and odd days and things like that. It was the only rationing of oil and gas since World War II. Since World War II, the only one I ever saw with my own eyes until the natural disaster of Hurricane Sandy. It's the only one I ever saw with my own eyes. In 1975, the United Nations, shameful resolution equating Zionism with racism, 3 years later. And in 1976, it was only a bold rescue at Entebbe that saved more than 100 people aboard a Lufthansa jet from certain death. But also on that day, in 1972, on that dark day, The seeds of a rebirth of sorts were replanted, at least for me, but I didn't know it yet. Neither did anyone else know it at that point. But I want to start by saying not everyone that day from the Israeli team was killed. Some athletes did escape beyond the 11 who were killed. And one such athlete, one of the escapees from that initial burst into the room was a race walker, and his name is Shaul Ladani. And Ladani was a Holocaust survivor who'd emigrated to Israel. And he knew as he saw the events beginning to unfold, he has to tell the world what is happening in this Olympic village. And he knew he has to tell somebody from the American team. That's the team that has to know. And he knew exactly one athlete on the American team. And that athlete was a young Yale graduate whose name was Frank Shorter. He was 2 years removed from finishing up at Yale. So Ladani did indeed tell Frank Shorter. And Frank Shorter said, well, I better tell somebody else. What do I know? And he turned to legendary Oregon track coach. His name was Bill Bowerman. Bowerman was not only a legendary track coach, he also was a World War II combat veteran. He would know what to do. He would know. Bowerman did know. He informed the authorities. But anyone who saw the events unfold know that ultimately letting the world know was useful in terms of its PR value, I suppose, but it did not save Israeli lives. Those not killed in the original break-in died with their captors on the tarmac at Munich. But it was on that day, really that day and the following, that a hugely important decision had to be made. Because the marathon, Shorter's event, had yet to be run. Should the American team participate? What was the value of participating? What was the value of boycotting it, if you will? And I should tell you, this is not a simple decision, even after more than half a century of reflection. I don't know. But Shorter made the choice to compete. He said what the terrorists wanted is for those games to be interrupted. So in memory of those 11 of our fellow athletes, let's do our best. Let's do what we came to do. Let's complete the task. And you know what Shorter did? Shorter won the gold medal in the marathon. Historically great performance, by the way. He took down the great Abibi Bikila, the great African runner. And he was the first American to win a gold medal in the marathon since 1908. John Hayes. No one's done it since, by the way. And at about the same time, as Shorter was busy winning a gold medal, this guy, Bill Bowerman, and his protege, his name was Phil Knight, had this little company they were working with called Blue Ribbon Sports. Blue Ribbon Sports, they were shoe guys, athletic wear guys. And they said, we really need a rebrand here. And they came up with a pretty good rebrand. It's called Nike. 1972, Beaverton, Oregon. And he was already working on designs for his early running shoes. And one of those was created when he poured extruded rubber, it's a true story, into his wife's waffle iron. And he thought, that's a great design for a shoe. And that is how the Nike waffle trainer was born. Now, inspired by Shorter's victory and powered by Bowerman's Nike footwear, which was state-of-the-art then, far from it today, of course, the United States experienced an extraordinary running boom in those next few years. Let me give you an idea of the magnitude. In 1972, right before the Olympics, it may have been right after the Olympics anyway, the New York Marathon, its third edition, had 187 finishers. And of the 187 finishers that day, exactly 2 were women. That's it. There were 2 women. By 1976, The total number of finishers was more than 1,500. Total number of participants, more than 2,000. And hundreds of women were now finishing the race, not two. And it was in that fall of 1976 that my mother got me my very first running shoes. You guessed it, Nike Waffle Trainers, created by Bill Bowerman to get me started in the long distance running, inspired by Frank Shorter. I should tell you, my mother, blessed memory, worried that she was spending $30 on running shoes for a 12-year-old kid. But given that I'm still running at 60, I'm pretty sure she's pleased with the investment of those $30. But there are two things you can feel as a child when you're faced with this kind of reality. You can either say, I don't want to be part of the Jewish people, because who wants to be part of a people that's oppressed, that's murdered at international contests for no reason at all? Or you can say, the Jewish people need me. I'm here to be part of the group which will change the world in a positive way, and that will be my response. And even as a kid, this was not a hard question. I knew I was very proud to be Jewish, and I knew I wanted to do something to help the Jewish people. And I decided, not so many years after that, that's what was going to happen. But I want to fast forward nearly 40 years, and I was 47 years old, and I was picking up my race packet. I'd now been a runner for quite a few years, for the New York Marathon, and you pick up your packet in the Javits Center. And I was a member of one of the charity teams. It was UJA's charity team, as a matter of fact. And I came upon a man seated at a table for one of the other Jewish charity teams. So being polite, I struck up a conversation with him, and he introduced himself as a man named George Wolfe, Holocaust survivor. And he explained that his organization, the Blue Card, provides millions of dollars in support of indigent Holocaust survivors. And I told him that I'm thrilled to learn about his group, because it turns out my aunt was a survivor of the Holocaust. And he told me, well, knowing that, being on this team for you is personal, not just professional, because he knew I was a rabbi. He said, it's personal. And I said, I don't know how many marathons I have left. And he said, if you just have one, it's ours. I told him, if I have one left, if I can squeeze one more out, you'll have it. And I did that in 2013. That was the 10th and last. But I want to show you what I saw on that day in 2013. When I looked around, I saw a race which I had read about this, but still, to my amazement, was preceded by a minyan. And by the way, one of the founders of that minyan was the recently deceased Rabbi Jim Michaels. He was a founder of the New York Marathon Minyan. History says, his son corrected history a little bit for me, but history said that he and another man were saying Kaddish. They arranged for a minyan, and who came across it? The New York Roadrunners president, Fred Lebo. And he said, what are you guys doing? Well, sir, we're having a minyan. He said, I'm a Romanian Holocaust survivor. What I want to know is, why wasn't I invited to this thing? I mean, what are you talking about? He came every year thereafter. And not only was there a minyan for the Jewish participants, but after the founding of that minyan, other religious groups said, well, if they can have a service before the race, why not for our runners the same thing? And there's a whole line of different religious services, a whole area in Staten Island before the start of the race, enabling people to recite the statutory prayers for their respective faith groups. And on that day in 2013, there were 8 Jewish charity teams, and all of those were raising funds for Jewish causes, every single one of them. And the largest group in the race every year is called Fred's Team, named after Fred Lebo, Holocaust survivor. And every year, they raise hundreds of thousands of dollars just in that team for cancer research and treatment. And on that day, in 2013, where more than 45,000 runners, not 187, 45,000 lined up at the starting line, I learned that 1/6 of the people participating had earned entry spots through charity teams. And each participant in such team, by the way, usually has to raise somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 for the organization. Multiply that by 7,500. It turns out that that year, on that day in 2013, the New York Marathon raised more than $30 million for charity. And that was their goal, to raise $1 million to help others for each mile of the race. And they exceeded that goal. And by the way, for the curious, on that day, more than 2 women finished the race. Actually, women's equality certainly applies to the sport of marathon running, and every year, including that day in 2013, the number of finishers who were women exceeded slightly those numbers for men. So what happened? I was inspired by a running boom, kicked off by 3 people I never met or knew, never saw even once. Bill Bowerman, who created the shoes I ran in and the athletic wear I train in today. Frank Shorter, who inspired people to try the marathon. And Shaul Adani, Holocaust survivor, who, among other things, inspired me to want to do something for other Holocaust survivors less successfully. By the way, Ladani is still alive, and he enjoyed a successful teaching career at Ben-Gurion University. He's a Columbia PhD. And on that day, I thought to myself in 2013, everything that we hold dear as part of life negated the efforts of the Black September Palestinian terrorists on that day. On that day in 1972, that dark day, they prevailed, but in the longer term, they were defeated, because Amalek is defeated not only on a field of battle. Amalek is defeated in the marketplace of ideas. And what are the ideas that we showed on that day in 2013? Charity, equality, religious fellowship. Those triumphed. And what were defeated? What I call terrorist triumvirate: corruption, misogyny, and bigotry. Those were not in evidence that day. Of course, the lapse of time between 1972 and 2013 is more than 4 decades. But it was worth the journey. It was worth the journey. But I would say to you that we're reminded by the Torah that the battle of Amalek is fought over and over again. It says, Ki yad al kesya milchama ba'amalek midor dor, that in every generation, you're going to have to face down some Amalek. The Amalek you defeated last time will have to be faced down another time. And the Amalek of October the 7th was a lot more frightening. Let me tell you something. It was a lot more frightening for so many reasons than the Amalek of 1972. The scale of the event, the brutality of the event, and yes, the horror of the event. You know, some days I'm grateful for high-definition television, but I'm glad in those years they didn't broadcast all the images, thank heavens. These were much more haunting. But I'm here to say that we have no doubt within our walls young people, maybe even kids, maybe even 8-year-olds, who saw those horrors. And their reaction is not going to be, is schwer zu sein Yid, it's hard to be a Jew, or I don't want to be Jewish, or all the more reason to give all this up and find myself just as part of a larger assimilated population into which I can blend easily. On the contrary, I believe there are many people who's that day determined to redouble their efforts to serve Am Yisrael. But we're not going to see it today, and we're not going to see it tomorrow. These young people have a long, long battle on their hands to see that day. To see that day. And let me tell you, it's a long battle, and I hope I'll see the end of that, the victory day that I saw about a decade ago. But I may not be in the cards. I don't know. But I'll tell you something. I believe that when we point to something, we say, on that day, everything changed. It doesn't have to be something lost in the misty past. It could be something that's happening right now. And there's no distinction between what happened to me in 1972, what happened to young people, especially a half a century later. It doesn't matter. Take it upon yourself, the journey, the Jewish journey, because it takes the world from darkness to light, servitude to freedom, hatred to love. And my wish for this year, 5,785, is that you believe that the redemption was born on that day. Martov.